Hi, I wanted to share a little bit about why we wrote this story and what it means to us.
I wanted to get into my own history about my Croatian background that just felt lost to me, that I didn't feel like I understood it. And when I tried to read one book about it, there was so much religious discussion, I didn't understand anything, and so it took so much effort to try to get through that. And eventually I just came to all these other conclusions about where we got with our holidays, and finally my husband this year just dared me to get something out. The rhyming with solstice somehow just matched perfectly with 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, so I started going down that road. That poem was written exactly 200 years ago, and the cool thing about that date, 1823, that's the first time we see Santa with reindeer and a sled and coming down the chimney. That really didn't exist in writing yet. And I've listened to a lot of talks on mushrooms and nature, and I learn something every time I listen to those. But always, even in the books, they'll say, there's a connection maybe with the Siberian mushroom, but there's no way to link it. And I completely disagree with that, because 1800s history, that's exactly when the explorations into the North Pole and Siberia were coming into the American consciousness, the same time as the Santa image was forming. And you start learning about Christianity in a new light. I grew up Catholic, and I think there's 70% of Americans would say they're Christian, or at least raised that way. And so I'm always nervous to say the wrong thing, but just looking at the science and the dates, there's some history there that you just cannot deny. Some of it's really dark and scary, and I eventually do want to write a deeper story about this, because when you look at how these native communities lost their voice, basically wherever the missions went, they basically tried to make one kind of a people, one story, and we started to lose track of these other stories that happened before them. And the story of Christmas brings in these Siberian natives, it brings in the pagan non-Christians that were all over the world celebrating the sun on winter. And then you also see the cultures that led to Christianity, the Judaism that was influenced by the Egyptian religion, and Mithraism out of Persia, the god of light, and all of those have sun connections. As humans, we start delineating ourselves by these factions of religion, and they all come back to this common thread. We can all look at this holiday of Santa, the tree, and see that it's flourishing all around the world. It's in Japan, that's obviously not a Christian nation, and you see it in many homes with whatever religion. And the thing that scares me to say, but I have to say it as I start learning more, is we were always taught that Santa's a lie, and Santa was not the lie. He was a Siberian shaman doing celebratory religious mushroom in a very safe way that was learned over generations. But the real lie was this placement of someone's birthday that was really of the sun, and people voted on it around 83 AD to put it on this date. It was an unknown date. You start to slowly unravel all of these things that brought us to this point. And there's a few different threads that I can go down here, but obviously the most important is to honor the sun, even on what the sun does to us. Vitamin D is a hormone. That's a misnomer. The scientists designated it incorrectly, and we found out during COVID one of the most important things was to take vitamin D, or just go get it naturally by being out in the sun. A hormone isn't just nothing. That's a really important thing that drives your energy that you have all day, your ability to fight different diseases.
The word solstice itself means sun standing still, because for 3 or 4 days, it appears that the sun is staying in one place. And the solstice used to be on December 25th, but when we changed to the Gregorian calendar in the 1500s, it got shifted by a few days. But Saturnalia, the Roman version of celebrating Sol Invictus, was on December 25th, as well as many other religions as we go back in time.
The furthest thread that I could find of people worshiping the sun in writing was in the Vedic traditions. This is the stem of the Mithraic religions, and were recognized by the UNESCO a masterpiece of oral heritage. They had 3,000 years straight of poetic hymns that did not change up until 1000 BC. This is 1,000 years before the Christ figure came around, this heritage of singing praises of this Persian god of light. Then all over the world you see Stonehenges, hundreds, thousands of them, where very intelligent communities were tracking the sun because that's just something we all as humans understand and gravitate to. They didn't have the science that we have today, but they were so much more connected to nature. Then you get to the Siberian story, all about these natives that would find their mushrooms that grew underneath pine tree-like presents. They would dress in bright colors to match out in snow. They would wear bells to be heard. They would climb in through the chimney, and there is no one else in the world that can come up with anything even remotely close to understanding why a fat man would be climbing through a chimney. And reindeer and snow, all of these clues bring us to a very specific time and place. The reason that started coming into our consciousness is because Russia started to own Siberia in the 1500s, and they had all these explorations from the 1700s on, meeting with these Siberian people. It's not a nice meeting. They are taxing the people by requiring them to pay a certain number of furs for every person. Just like every other place that you see these missions coming through, the population gets decimated by 90%. And if they don't convert, they just don't survive. You don't see anyone being able to hold on to their heritage unless they're in these far-off places like this, where you still see these people practicing their native traditions and still do it. You start seeing that message start coming into America by the journals and the expeditions and the translations into English. You could find the headlines of these stories just a few years before 'Twas the Night Before Christmas came out. For anyone who says they don't understand the connection, that's it. And within 100 years, the Siberian Railroad was there. And you don't get a railroad without many expeditions. You also see Santa's image being formed by public opinion, especially by Thomas Nast, a major illustrator around the 1860s. So this is 30 years after 'Twas the Night poem came out, and we start to have more images of Santa. He was the original political cartoonist who came up with the Republican Democratic images, basically helping illustrate this image of Santa over 24 years of cover art. And it starts with the I won't get the right word. Yeah, it's the Civil War. So people are gone from home over Christmas, so they're really longing to be home with their family. And that's when he starts making this cover art. And Santa becomes this jolly person catered towards children. And also in Alaska, we started bringing over some reindeer in the early 1900s because of the overfishing in Alaska. Someone wanted to help the Inuit natives and said, let's help them become reindeer herders. So in the 19s, we've got reindeer being migrated in, and by 1930, we have Rudolph. There's these ads people in America using this symmetry that's in the headlines of people trying to make it to the North Pole, which they finally do in 1906. There is an argument that, okay, the reason it started to be catered towards children is because the Christmas holiday was a little too rambunctious and people were getting too drunk in the street, and that is true. There's actually a ban on Christmas in the 1600s, right around when America was forming, and that's because the Puritans that came over from Britain brought over these laws saying, you know what, we realize there's nothing in the Bible about Christ being born on Christmas, and we are going to be very strict about it. And they were the faction of Christianity that was in power in Parliament, so they made these laws. It was passed in the United States, so nobody had any form of celebration in America, this new world, for at least 100 years until the 1800s. And you've got all of this. Oh, also the immigrants started coming in from Germany, so those were other people that were holding on to their pagan celebrations with the Christmas tree. Once they start coming in the 18th, that's added to this lore of what Christmas could be. And so it's like public opinion, people not having something to celebrate. Sure, they were getting really drunk, but that was part of the celebration that people would have all around the world because the winter time was really tough. People were having a really hard time. In Siberia, where these native lands, a lot of these stories are coming from, they would have only 4 hours of sunlight in a day, and they would get numb, or they would just get overly celebrative. People in the church getting upset about it being too much and maybe not being about Jesus Christ, but you find out none of it really points to that time and that celebration being about Jesus, except by name, to cover up and try to turn this celebration into something else. And the church tried, it didn't really work. But certain people in New York that were trying to help convert more of the celebration into buying things for the holiday, focusing on the middle-class family, and sending the message in that direction. And many different quotes of people starting to recognize and try to reconcile this sun with whatever holy figure that they're showing. And it wasn't until 325 AD when Christianity was officially a state religion in the Roman Empire, but that emperor
Constantine worshipped Sol Invictus, the invincible sun. That was the Roman version of this Mithraic religion that we were talking about that stems back to 7000 BC. The soldiers were bringing back, after 100 years of wars with Persia, Rome and Persian cultures started to mix, and they brought in these ideas that were much older from the Middle East and India.
It wasn't until his deathbed that
Constantine
converted Christianity. That's where you start seeing this conversion happening in real time. But before that, there was the Jewish religion and then the Egyptian religion. Around the time that Judaism was forming, Egyptian power was major at the time, and they have all of these pieces that lended itself to the Christianity image of the Isis, the virgin that gave birth and was a virgin every day somehow. She had a resurrected son equated to the sun that comes back every day. You see the halo, the word Christ, and just many different things that ended up being reconciled into this religion. And then when you go from 325 AD to 600 AD, so another 300 years, you see Pope Leo and Pope Gregory. All these popes have quotes saying they're disgusted that they're still seeing people worship the sun when they enter these churches, not understanding, or maybe fully understanding, that these churches actually were on top of sacred sites that were already facing the sun, and all our churches and graveyards still face the sun. And over again, we covered up these older traditions, and then we tried to merge the naming, right? The sun with the sun, S-O-N or S-U-N. And I have lists of some of these different things that we run into over and over again. And okay, that's all fine and good. That's Christianity. You have to go there with Christmas because it's in the name. There's so many quotes on the religious side that you can help make this case, but in the end, it really doesn't matter in terms of if it's a Christian holiday or not. People now celebrate it, and that's a wonderful thing. And you find out the story of Jesus is a beautiful story, whether or not he existed. And you can deepen your understanding of that story by understanding what caused it to be in creation, and learn about the Egyptian stories that have it written up in the stars of the entire story, or the Babylonians, or the other pagans that existed, or the Jewish culture that obviously influenced in a heavily way. And if you want to understand Christianity better, you have to go in this direction, because those were the places that we still call mysteries and cults, but had a major influence on those stories. And you see those over and over again being celebrated in different ways and different names. But when you look at the original translation of the Bible in Hebrew, you get much different interpretations. It's a much less misogynistic society. Just one example, when you talk about Adam and Eve, in the Bible it says, this person was born of this person. It was never she born of him. That was a translation of a Roman historian that chose to make that designation. And so there's all these liberties that are taken over and over again in these translations. And I was basically trying to take the power into this one person's version, and the difference of coming to this new thinking of the holidays is to say anyone has access to this. The magic is shared with all of us. We all have this energy that kind of comes back, and no matter if we pass away or not, like, that energy comes back in a different way, in a different form, and no one can explain it. There's no theologian, there's no PhD in anything, science or religion, that can say they know more than anyone else, because this is all this philosophy on life and the holidays. And that's what we've been trying to crack for forever, and we're never going to get there. And that's a nice thing, that we won't ever get there. So, okay, and I have to give the last little plug on the mushroom itself. I think the mushroom is a huge symbol. The tree and the sun are all these natural symbols that anyone around the world could celebrate. But when you actually look at the mushroom itself, that a lot of our holiday traditions come from celebrating this mushroom. It stands for being nature's connector. The mushroom in itself opens up our minds to a new experience and keeps your senses alive, and it gets you to just look at the world a little differently. Pay attention to what's the quiet ones, what's growing underneath the ground. These mushrooms have lived for millions of years. They are older than our oldest trees. The DNA that we've been able to find, our oldest fossils are these gigantic mushrooms that went underground when all life died on Earth and the dinosaurs went extinct for maybe 100 million years. The mushrooms lived before that and after, and they went underground, and they became this connector between trees. They started to connect trees with each other. You could find mother trees with the wood wide web that is starting to become more recognized. You're sending electric signals and nutrients between trees by this fungal connection. And the other thing that the fungus do is they bring dead things to life. They're the things that grow on your food to help decay it, to turn it into something else that becomes the humus in the soil and creates good soil. And these mushrooms are a whole different species than plants or animals, because they don't get their energy from the sun, they get their energy from decaying matter. fire. And so along with the sun, the mushroom is this endlessly regenerative species that is basically resurrecting itself over and over again. I love the thought of digging into your own roots. You end up just working so hard because you really just want to know. There's no agenda. You just want to understand how far it goes. If anyone has these native stories or has access to them, ask the older people that you know, write them down because they're actually really hard to find. A lot of the native communities need more of a voice and don't know where to go. I see a lot of those kind of comments of, I don't know where to go or where to get information from because everything's biased. But you just have to start somewhere, whether it's scary or not, and listen too. I love how the connection with children, how all of these holidays come back to being a kid and thinking about how we can decide today how we want to celebrate and how we want to tell the stories to our own children. I've always been a shy person, but once you become a mom, I have someone to fight for. But it's not for me anymore. I don't want to perpetuate this thing that I don't think is right anymore. The things you remember as a kid, when the missionaries come through, they tried so hard. The hardest thing to take from people are their celebrations, the things that they had as a child, songs, and the food. A lot of those things that happen around the holidays are the things people are last willing to give up. And that's why it was so important for people to try to put a different name on it, because what you do as a child really sits with you forever.
Your taste preferences start to form before you're 3 years old. And that's why 3-year-olds start to become really picky.
When you start running around, you want that food again. You don't pick up the wrong plants and eat poison. And there's certain points in your life where you become open and other points closed off. A lot of people want psilocybin or something that gets you out of this mode. As we get older, we're only 20% receptive. When we're young, we're 80% receptive. And it usually takes some kind of a life event or mental change or giving birth or just traveling or going down a different route than you usually go to start noticing different things and get yourself out of this rut that you're in. These native traditions had a much better understanding of regenerative farming, of using the land in a more realistic way. Our use of the land, just using up the resources. It turns out we're just using up the topsoil and then moving on, but at some point we can't just do that anymore. There's fires, and the Native Americans come back to Yosemite, people that were young, and they come back and they say, oh my gosh, this is a mess. This isn't how it's supposed to be, because people were gardeners. They say the original rainforests were not just random. It was a garden of somebody's that was cultivated over many generations. Our model of farming that we're teaching is not one that's sustainable, and we need to go back to these people that we ignored. There's a beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass that talks about how the native cultures would make these baskets and they're laughed at. The women used moss, whatever they were doing, it didn't matter. Turns out the moss was used as natural diapers, which is 20 times more absorbent than paper. Their baskets, they were incredibly amazing baskets. They were waterproof, they could sift through, they had every different kind that you could use it for, and they were beautiful. And they were training the trees to grow in a certain way so that the sticks would be straight and not all thorny and all over the place. It was years and generations of always thinking more down the line. And Hawaiian culture, another native culture that was very recently pushed aside, but every island was divided out like pizzas so that each family or clan was able to have all the resources from the fresh water to the ocean. And that's a much more sustainable way of life than coming through and just trying to have pineapples. Someone else brought and said, we can use this land for that, or sugarcane, or whatever it is. That's still our mindset in America. It's not an intelligent way. It's not a regenerative mindset. We need to come back to that. And then the other thing was about feeling disenchanted. When we stripped these societies, when Christianity took these idols and then smashed all the meaning behind it, made people forget. That's what you're seeing today, is people not feeling connected. When I would go to church, it felt so sterile. Maybe if they sang or did something to try to connect, it would have felt different, and I wouldn't have felt as much of a need to find out the true meaning of all this stuff. It's a good thing. Sometimes it's good to shake up your world a little bit and have to look deeper. And trying to push the biology aside and saying, okay, we're gonna just have this person have a power trip and have no sexual outlet. That's a bad thing. Just to give any person that power and then no sexual outlet. The statistics are just really ugly there. Doing something to get you back down to be more humble, to follow some biological rhythms as opposed to trying to say, I'm above that and being animalistic is absolutely evil. There are moments like childbirth. Being animalistic actually helps birth go along, getting out of your head. It's okay to reach that part of you and to connect with animals, connect with the spiritual world or whatever it is.
We live in this society that prizes being isolated. We pay for our isolation. There's a great book called Tribe that is very short. We pay for this isolation and we're more sick for it. We're more depressed and anxious. Coming together as a species and with other species is so healthful for us. And I believe there's a very big difference between finding the magic within yourself and needing to work through somebody like a priest and being able to pay for your sins to be revoked. That just does not sit well with me. The earth revolves around the sun. We don't have to be mad if someone hypothesizes something different. We are all connected. We learn about how octopus react to things and how smart they are. Just because you don't have a spine doesn't mean you don't feel pain. Starfish and jellyfish change our whole concept of what it means to be alive and to have a soul and to have a feeling. What about the trees that bend and sway a certain way, and now we see they protect their young? It makes us feel more connected, that we could go walk in the forest and feel connected, to know that we're breathing in things that are good for us. And to know this is where we're meant to be. We're not meant to be in a square box, this square, hollow, silent box that is not good for children, it's not good for babies, and it's not good for us either.
I wanted to share this quote from 1951 by Carl Jung, who was a psychiatrist. He didn't like Freud, he broke away from him. He talks about Mithraism, the Persian god of light, and says, "The sun is the truly rational image of God, whether we adopt the standpoint of a primitive savage or of modern science." And paraphrasing it a little bit, he says, the discord of the human soul, the issues that are being happen with the human soul can be resolved through the sun. Because a natural object has no inner conflict. It shines equally on the just and the unjust. You can allow things to flourish that are good as well as the harmful. It's bringing out the creative power of your own soul, the useful and the harmful. That's a beautiful summary of why the sun is such a wonderful image, and it's been seen as light and love and shedding insight into something. But it's good to get into the dark side too, having moments of introspection as well as. If anyone wants to find information, feel free to check out the poem. The whole thing's read on the site. You could read it for free. I really appreciate having the venue to have this conversation and